Hi, my name's Michaela Epstein. I'm the founder and director of Maths Teacher Circles, and welcome to this session on how to stop your students from forgetting what they learn. So let's dive in. In today's session, there's one thing that I can promise you. I can promise you lots of ideas. The stuff that I share with you today is what I've learned from over a decade of working with teachers globally. And I draw on research from across cognitive science, psychology, and conceptual development in mathematics. Now, there is one thing that I cannot promise you, however, and that is to use the word math. As you may have heard from my accent, I'm an Australian, and I have, for all of my life, been using the word maths. So please bear with me as I use that word throughout this session today. Our aim today is this: to help students to really retain what they learn in maths. So they're not coming out of lessons like that image on the left, but actually like the image on the right. We want that learning to be seeds that are planted and retained for the long term. When students remember what they learn, it's easier for them to progress. They have confidence in themselves and they're motivated to keep learning. So there's a whole lot of good stuff that happens. Yet the reality is that many skills are only learned at a surface level for students in maths. And quite often we find ourselves reteaching content that we know students have already been taught. So that's something that we're going to tackle today. And specifically, we're going to look at two questions. Firstly, when should students interact with content so that they remember what they learn? And secondly, how should students interact with that content? And what we'll see is how just looking at one of these questions on its own isn't actually enough, but the combination together brings long-lasting learning. Throughout this session, if you see this yellow button with pause and think, that's an invitation for you to stop the recording, for you to take some time to think about what's just been shared or a question that's been asked. I'm going to be sharing with you three principles and in response to this idea of how we can stop students from forgetting what they learn. These are things, the principles may touch on strategies that you're already using in your teaching. And hopefully by looking at them in relation to retention of learning and stronger learning, you'll be able to think even more purposefully about the stuff that you're already doing. But before I get started with these principles, we're going to do a memory quiz. This memory quiz comes in two parts, and after the second part, I'll invite you to have a think about what's going on in it. In this quiz, there are a few bits where I encourage you to pause the video. Really, you're going to have a really important and powerful experience by doing that, and that will help you through the rest of the session. So let's get started with part one. So I want you to take 1 minute to study these relations and see if you can commit them to memory. So go on, pause the video and take 1 minute. No writing. Okay, welcome back. Now, take another minute to write the symbol for each of these letters. Again, pause the video for yourself, take that minute and see how you go. All right, here are all of the answers. Have a look and see how you went. And I want to share something with you. So I've now run this quiz with thousands of teachers. And if you found this part one difficult, you're not alone. Because in fact, less than 5% get all 9 correct in part one. And I want to share some responses after I ran this with a group of teachers recently. So these were some of the comments that came up, and I found it fascinating, and particularly when we get to part two, you might notice something interesting going on. So some of the teachers said, oh, I only got 2 or I only got 3. They talked about what they forgot, how they had anxiety, and they tried to find ways of organizing it, but they found it difficult. So maybe that was similar to your own experience. We're going to come to part 2 a bit later on, but first I would like to share our first principle for how to stop your students from forgetting what they learn. And it's this: to use spaced, not massed practice. And this answers the question of when should your students interact with content. And I want to ask you a couple of questions. Firstly, how would you ideally spend 6 hours of study for an exam? Would you A, do 6 hours the day before, or B, spread that 6 hours over the 2 weeks before? Now, of course, there's going to be deviation in how people respond, but the most common answer that I see is B. Now, a second question for you. How do we typically organize practice for students? Do we A, do 20 questions from exercise 5D or whatever it is today, or B, do 12 questions now and spread the last 8 over the next few weeks? Again, think about typically, and there is deviation, but in fact, when I have asked teachers very strongly, the one that is most common is A. So I've got a disparity happening in how we ideally practice versus what we do in reality. And I want to share a couple of graphs with you that start to dig out why the ideal might look different. So this is a graph that comes from a researcher by the name of Hermann Ebbinghaus, and maybe you've heard of it. It's commonly known as the forgetting curve. There are a couple of things that are fascinating about this particular graph. Firstly, the data collected by Ebbinghaus was in the late 1800s, yet this is a graph that is still shared and relevant today. And that's because it's been replicated over time. So let me just break down what we've got going on in this graph. Along the x-axis, going along the bottom, is the number of days since the learning happened. So it starts from 0 and then you get towards, over a month. And on the y-axis going up, we've got the percentage of information retained. So of what was learned, how much is then remembered. And what you can see in this graph is there is a very sharp decline. Even within the first hour, a huge chunk of information is quickly forgotten. And I think this is a really interesting one in terms of considering, well, what parallels there might be for our students in maths. And especially when they're going through their day and learning a huge amount, not just in maths, but across all different subjects. So this is the first graph, and I want to share with you one more. Take a look at this one. So in this graph, again, we've got the number of days going along the x-axis and the percentage of information retained going along the y. But this time what's happened is on a regular basis, that initial information has been reviewed. And every time that review has happened, the memory of that learning has gone back up to the top again. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that by revisiting old content, that memory gets stronger. Now, Rodiger and Pye did some research in 2012, and they explained if information is repeated back to back, so in that massed kind of fashion, 20 questions all at once sort of thing, it's often learned quickly but not very securely, so that forgetting happens. But if information is repeated in this distributed pattern like we can see in this graph, it's learned more slowly, but it's retained for much longer. Now, interestingly, this graph is very important because it's not just happened in one context. In fact, Dunlowski and colleagues in 2013, they reviewed contemporary research in this area, and they found that this idea of the spaced practice has a large effect across a range of students, ages, topics, and forms of assessment. Okay, so actually this is a very robust finding, and even like the effect gets stronger when you start to increase the spacing between the reviews over time. So again, I invite you to just have a think about what that might mean for your students in maths and how this research finding could be used to help your students. You probably will have some ideas that will come immediately to mind for yourself, and I'd like to share a couple as well. So here are 3 strategies for how you might like to include space practice in the classroom. Firstly, you can put old topics into maths routines. I'll share a maths routine a bit later on, but these are bite-sized routines where you can just quickly help students to revisit important stuff from one lesson to the next. Or you might put old topics into homework sets, or my favorite is actually putting it into non-routine problem solving. And in that context of non-routine problem solving, students are then making connections between old topics, probably in quite new ways to what they'd seen before. When you're doing this, there's a whole lot of stuff that students have been taught, okay? So how do you decide what to do? An idea I keep in mind is something from last week, last topic, and last term. And you can use that as a way to decide what to weave into that space practice in whatever fashion you do. So I'd like to give you a moment now to decide what's one thing that you would like to commit yourself to doing next to apply space practice in the classroom. Take a moment to have a think about it and then write it down. All right, so that was space practice. One problem, however, with just focusing on space practice is that while it tells you when students should interact with content in order to remember what they learn, it says nothing about how they should interact with content. And before we get to the second principle, it's time for part 2 of the memory quiz. So the rules of the game are exactly the same this time, except what you'll be looking at will be slightly different. Again, please do pause the video for the amounts of time that are shown on the screen, and to really get the full experience of this. So here we go. So again, here are some relations. Take a minute to study them and see if you can commit them to memory without writing anything down. Over to you. All right, now it's time for the quiz. Again, you'll have 1 minute to write the symbol down for each of the letters listed. And you can pause the video. Okay, welcome back. Have a look through. How did you go this time? And I'm curious, did you go better than part 1? Worse, or was it the same? Last time I showed you a list of responses from other teachers after they'd experienced part 1. I want to share those same teachers' responses after part 2 and have a read through because the differences are very interesting. I find it fascinating the sort of emotions that are jumping out in part 1 versus part 2. And particularly in terms of thinking about the maths classroom, I think this is really important because we see a lot and we hear a lot about the prevalence of maths anxiety in the classroom, and how problematic it is and how much it stops students from being able to progress in their learning. And so I think this is a really interesting snapshot of what that experience can be like for the learner, and what to then consider what that might mean for our practice. So with these teachers whose responses we've got on the screen right now, I then asked them this question: what does a memory quiz have to do with teaching and learning maths? And maybe even pause the video now to have a think about it for yourself. I'm going to also share their responses. Okay, so here are what kind of the threads of what came through, and some direct quotes from teachers. Okay, organisation and how it connected to something you already know affects memory and retention. Organisation helps so much. If you see connections and relationships, it's easier to do the task. Maths isn't random, but it's structured and organised. Isn't it interesting that these same words are just coming through again and again? Connections are integral. When students can see the big picture, it's so much easier to remember things. Connections have to be made and built for each learner. I really like that reflection, and I think it's a very important one, because it's not just the same connection for all learners, but different learners will connect to the content in different ways. What maybe helped you in part 2 or even part 1 of the memory quiz was probably different from someone else who did it, and how they made sense of the information that was presented. Some of the other quotes: seeing patterns makes learning so much easier. Math is full of connections and patterns, so we need to help students see those if we want the learning to stick. And give it meaning, and there is more retention. Okay, so some very strong ideas coming through, and maybe you notice these same things yourself, or something even slightly different. But it's a really nice path into our second principle. So let me share that with you now. So our second principle for how to stop your students from forgetting what they learn is to make learning connected, not isolated. Interestingly, Ebbinghaus, who created the forgetting curve, he had used nonsense words, words like lack and hull. And it turns out that the brain doesn't hold on to nonsense words for very long, but it does hold on to stuff that's meaningful. So I'd like to present kind of two different views on learning in mathematics. The first one is called the ladder view. And this is the idea that, the things that students have to learn in maths are these rungs on the ladder. They climb up, they tick one off, and then go on to the next one. But this view of learning is fragile. It's easy to fall off, and it's hard to get back on again. And this ladder view is a bit like the experience of part 1 of the quiz. And in contrast with that is something known as the web view. The web view is more robust because we have lots of connections happening. The web view is like part 2 of the quiz. We build stronger networks of understanding and knowledge because we take lots of different pathways to get there. The quiz showed how important relevant knowledge is. Interestingly, sometimes even with the background knowledge, maths can be confusing. And there's some research from John Mason and Anne Watson which kind of brings this to light. They showed that a mathematical concept doesn't always have clear boundaries of meaning. If you look at a textbook definition, it's very precise. And for those, for us teachers with expert knowledge, we understand the textbook definition because we've learned what's going on. We understand that concept. But for a student, there can often be these grey areas, things that aren't obvious to them when they're first encountering a concept. So for example, a triangle. A triangle we know has 3 corners, 3 straight edges, and the angles sum to 180 degrees. But students encounter triangles all over the place that have round corners, so they're not really triangles, but they still call them triangles. So we've got this fuzziness to what we see in mathematical concepts. And Di Seaman and her colleagues in 2020 talked about that understanding and retention then comes from flexibly using representations of a concept and linking and translating between those representations. So going back and forth. And that's how connections and that's how understanding is built. And I'm going to share two strategies with you now that you can use with your students to help them make connections far more easily. The first one is using a routine called two groups. And in a moment, you're going to see 4 items. And the question is, how might you split those items into 2 groups? So here they are. And take a moment to pause and think. Now, here are a range of responses that different teachers have come up with. And maybe you had something similar or maybe you had something different. What's quite interesting about these responses is they show very different conceptual ideas, but also language. And 2 groups is really important and powerful for highlighting language like arrays. So if you see those first 2 dot points of responses, one person saw it in terms of the 2 groups in terms of rows, and another saw the 2 groups in terms of arrays. They came up with the same ways of splitting the items, but the language they used was different. And so this routine is a really powerful way of emphasizing important vocabulary and conceptual ideas. Here's another one. So if you'd like to, take a moment and pause and think. And here are some responses. I'm going to share at the end of the session where you can get access to these slides. I won't spend too long on this particular one right now. But I do want to emphasize that with 2 groups, we've got this opportunity to help students to compare features, to go back and forth and look beyond basic definitions so that they can push the boundaries for their own understanding of what a concept is and isn't. Here is a second strategy that you can use with your students. This is known as a Freya model. Maybe you've had experience using it in other subject areas, and I think it is fantastic for maths. And let me show you an example of how you might use it. So we'll go back to that triangle example. Students might initially have some ideas about triangles, and here I've started to populate this Freya model. What I think is a really nice feature of this model is that it can be built up over time. So you don't need to just use it in one lesson and then forget about it. But particularly for important mathematical ideas, you can have students build on it over time. So as they get a more nuanced understanding of that concept, that comes through on this page. So if we kept going with the triangle, here's what it could look like afterwards. And again, I'm going to share at the end not only where you can get access to these slides, but a printable version of this Freya model that you can use with your students. So here are 3 strategies for creating connections in the classroom. Using tasks that focus on, firstly, what a concept is and isn't, and that's what both the Freya model and 2 groups really help with. Secondly, organising knowledge. And thirdly, linking concrete, visual and abstract representations and remembering to go back and forth between those representations. And a question that you can keep in mind as you're creating connections is, what do your students know, not know, and also what's important for you to keep coming back to it and focusing on. So your turn now. Take 30 seconds to write down what one thing is that you're going to commit yourself to doing to create connections in the classroom, and write it down. All right, welcome back. Now, even with space practice and with making learning connected, there's one piece left for helping our students to remember what they learn. And that's the third principle of asking for reasons, not just answers. So let's dive in. Reasoning is about logically thinking through, reflecting on, and justifying ideas in mathematics. And I like to call reasoning the glue that holds all maths together. Okay? With reasoning, Students are making sense of their thinking, their answers, their strategies. They see that maths is about logic and it's not just about following someone else's steps. And when students have those logical steps and those reasons in mind, they can use that to follow what's going on. Okay, it helps them to organize their thinking and means that there's less to try and memorize overall. I want to share with you 5 types of reasoning tasks. What I love about these tasks is that they're easy to adopt and they're easy to get started, no matter what you're teaching. Okay, so they're quite adaptable. The first one is called incorrect solution. So it goes like this. You present students with a solution that's wrong and interesting in some way and ask them, why might I like this solution? And then how would you help this student with a similar problem next time? By doing this, students are justifying processes and they're identifying logically correct and incorrect steps. And this is a great one to use for common areas of confusion that you're noticing amongst your students. The second type of reasoning task is called what's the question? Okay, and simply it involves giving the answer, like the total is 16, the area is 48 meters squared or feet squared, the average age is 11, and then getting students to come up with a question or even multiple questions. This is a really powerful one because working backwards requires flexibility and students need to look at familiar ideas in a different way. This task is great to use with important concepts, especially those where you want students to be fluent with different approaches and strategies. The third type of reasoning task is a card sort. So it involves getting different representations of a concept and turning them into cards. And I recommend somewhere between like 6 and 12 different examples. So between 6 to 12 times table facts, for example. When students are engaging in a card sort activity, they're constantly justifying how those representations are linked. And this goes also actually hand in hand with creating connections. Again, this is useful to use when you've got a really important concept that you want students to become very familiar with and confident in. The fourth kind is to solve a problem in different ways. When students do that, they're looking at different paths to a solution, and it's also an opportunity to compare and contrast methods. This is great when there are problems where you know that it's important for students to be able to approach them flexibly, and where you want students to be discerning. Okay, so one thing I encourage is once students have solved a problem in different ways, to get them to evaluate those methods and think about which one may have been more or less helpful in a given situation. And the fifth type is called always, sometimes, or never. Okay, the onus is on using logic and evidence to justify ideas and finding counterexamples to prove an idea incorrect. So this is great for concepts where you want students to make new connections, including between existing ideas, and to dispel possible misconceptions that you know might arise. So here are the 5 types, and actually I've got a tool called a 2-minute planning template that has all of these 5 reasoning tasks in them, and at the end I'll show you where you can get access to this 2-minute planning template so that you can use it in your own practice. So to sum up reasoning, there are 3 strategies that I recommend using. We've got these 5 reasoning task types. You can also use a type of question called an explain question, which is, say a worked example or formula or a piece of vocabulary or even a diagram. And you ask students to explain what's going on there. And then the third strategy is to assess reasoning. If it's something that you want your students to get stronger in, then looking at how they're progressing over time and giving them feedback on them goes a long way. And really at the end of the day, reasoning involves small prompts to get your students thinking regularly. So finally, one more time, take 30 seconds to write down one thing that you're going to commit yourself to doing next to embedding reasoning in the classroom. right, so it's time to sum up, and I'm going to see where you might go next. And I'll be sharing that link as well with you for where you can get access to the resources. So in this session, we've looked at things that you can do so that your students leave your classroom, instead of having all of the important learning flying out of their mind, it actually has some important seeds that are planted, and then long-term retention happening. And specifically, we looked at when students should interact with content and how they should interact with content in order to remember what they learn. And we did that using these 3 principles, in which you wrote down 3 actions that you want to commit yourself to doing next. And before I share where you can get access to all of today's resources, I want to share a bit more about what more I can potentially support you with. With Maths Teacher Circles, a program that I love, we focus on bringing effective learning and fun together, and teachers come to us looking for new strategies to pass on a love of learning mathematics to their students. I run regular online maths workshops for all year levels where you'll get new strategies, you'll explore problems, games and routines, and you'll swap ideas in a global teacher community. It's a space for you to focus on yourself and your own learning and really get re-energized for teaching maths. So if you'd like to find out more about the workshops that I run, head on over to mathsteachercircles.org. And finally, if you'd like to get access to today's slides and resources, including the 2-minute planning template, the Freya model, the memory quiz, plus a copy of these slides, head on over to mathsteachercircles.org/BMM25. Thank you so much for joining me, and I wish you all the best. Bye-bye.